I knew something was wrong the moment everyone laughed except me. The family gathering was supposed to be simple. Daniel's aunt had volunteered to host a summer barbecue at her house, and nearly 30 relatives had shown up by mid-afternoon. Children ran through the backyard with water balloons. Someone had country music playing through outdoor speakers. Folding tables covered with food stretched across the patio. It was the kind of gathering that looked perfect in photographs. I remember standing beside Daniel near the drink table, feeling grateful that we finally had a quiet weekend to spend with family. We had been married for 3 years by then, and although I was never the loudest person in the room, I genuinely tried to be part of his family. I remembered birthdays. I brought homemade desserts. I sent thank you cards. I showed up. That afternoon felt no different, at least not at first. Margaret arrived nearly an hour after everyone else. The moment she stepped into the backyard, several relatives greeted her enthusiastically. She had always been the center of attention in family settings. Some people naturally carried that kind of energy. Margaret certainly did. She hugged Daniel, greeted me politely, and immediately launched into conversations with relatives she had not seen in months. Everything seemed normal. Then it happened. About 30 minutes later, everyone gathered near the patio while Daniel's uncle prepared burgers on the grill. Conversations overlapped in every direction. I was standing beside several cousins when Margaret suddenly smiled and said something that caused half the group to laugh. "You know who would have absolutely loved this party?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. Then she supplied the answer herself. Lauren. My stomach tightened before I even understood why. Lauren was Daniel's former girlfriend. They had dated years before I met him. I knew who she was because everyone knew who she was. Not because Daniel talked about her. He rarely did. But somehow her name continued appearing in family stories long after their relationship ended. Margaret laughed softly as though she had just shared a charming memory. Lauren always loved family gatherings, she continued. Several relatives nodded. One aunt smiled. Someone else mentioned remembering a camping trip from years ago. Suddenly an entire conversation formed around a woman who had not been part of Daniel's life for nearly a decade. I forced a smile. What else could I do? Nobody appeared uncomfortable except me. Daniel remained focused on a conversation about baseball with his cousin. He did not seem to notice. Margaret continued telling stories. She was always so outgoing, she said. Everybody loved having her around. Again people nodded. Again people smiled. I stared down at the paper plate in my hands. Rationally, I knew people were allowed to remember the past. Nobody was breaking a rule. Nobody was being openly cruel. Yet something about the moment felt wrong. I was standing there as Daniel's wife. Not a guest. Not a temporary visitor. His wife. And somehow I felt invisible while everyone celebrated someone who no longer belonged to the family. A few minutes later, Margaret glanced toward me. "No offense, Emily," she said with a cheerful smile. The moment those words left her mouth, I knew I was not going to like whatever came next. But Lauren just had a way of bringing people together. Several relatives laughed politely. I laughed too. At least I pretended to. Inside, however, something shifted. The comment was subtle enough that nobody could accuse Margaret of being rude. She had not insulted me directly. She had simply created a comparison. And comparisons have a way of saying things that words never explicitly state. For the rest of the afternoon, I found myself watching her more carefully. Every time she mentioned Lauren's name, people responded warmly. Every time I smiled. Every time I felt a little smaller. As the sun began to set and relatives started packing up leftovers, I tried convincing myself that I was overreacting. Maybe Margaret had simply been reminiscing. Maybe there was no deeper meaning. Maybe the entire thing was harmless. Yet on the drive home, I could not stop replaying the conversation. Daniel glanced over from the driver's seat. "You seem quiet," he said. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. Then I asked a question I never expected to ask. "Does your mother talk about Lauren every time I am not around?" Daniel did not answer immediately. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. He kept his eyes on the road while the headlights illuminated the empty highway ahead of us. Finally, he shrugged lightly. "Sometimes." That single word made my stomach sink. I turned toward him. "Sometimes." He glanced at me briefly. Not in a weird way, Emily. I looked back out the window. What does that mean? Daniel sighed. My family tells stories. They talk about people from the past all the time. Part of me wanted to accept that explanation. Another part of me could not ignore what had happened that afternoon. Do they talk about every former boyfriend and girlfriend the same way? I asked. Daniel hesitated again. Probably not. The answer was honest, which somehow made it worse. The rest of the drive passed quietly. When we arrived home, I tried to put the situation behind me. I changed clothes, washed my face, and settled onto the couch with a book. Yet every time I turned a page, my mind wandered back to the barbecue. More specifically, it wandered back to Margaret's expression when she looked directly at me before making the comparison. The next morning, I convinced myself that I was overthinking everything. Life returned to normal. Work deadlines filled my schedule. Daniel focused on several projects at the office. Days passed without any mention of Lauren. By the end of the week, I almost felt embarrassed for allowing a single conversation to affect me so deeply. Then Saturday arrived. Daniel and I attended a small birthday dinner for one of his cousins. The gathering was much smaller than the barbecue. Only 10 family members sat around a long restaurant table. For most of the evening, the atmosphere was pleasant. People shared stories. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of food. Laughter echoed throughout the restaurant. I was beginning to relax when Margaret suddenly turned toward another relative. Remember that charity auction years ago? She asked. The relative smiled immediately. The one at the country club. Margaret nodded. Yes. Lauren organized half of it practically by herself. Several people laughed warmly. Someone commented on how energetic Lauren had always been. Another person mentioned how everyone loved working with her. Once again, I sat quietly while a conversation formed around someone who no longer belonged to the family. This time, however, I paid closer attention. What bothered me was not simply that Lauren's name came up. It was how often Margaret introduced it. Nobody else had mentioned her. Nobody else seemed interested in revisiting that chapter of history. Yet Margaret repeatedly found ways to bring her into the conversation. Later that evening, I excused myself to use the restroom. As I walked back toward the dining area, I slowed when I heard familiar voices. I was not intentionally eavesdropping. The hallway was narrow, and their conversation carried clearly. Lauren always fit in so naturally, Margaret was saying. Someone else responded with a polite laugh. Then Margaret added, some people just know how to connect with families. The words hit me harder than they should have. Not because she said my name. She did not. Not because she openly criticized me. She did not do that either. The problem was what remained unsaid. I returned to the table and smiled through the rest of dinner, but something had changed. For the first time, I stopped focusing on Lauren herself. Instead, I started focusing on Margaret. Why was she doing this? What was she hoping to accomplish? When Daniel and I got home, I sat at the kitchen counter while he put leftovers into the refrigerator. Can I ask you another question? I said quietly. He looked up. Sure. I folded my hands together. Did your mother ever want you to marry Lauren? Daniel froze for a fraction of a second. The reaction was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. He closed the refrigerator door slowly. She liked Lauren. That was not an answer. Daniel. He rubbed the back of his neck. Yes. She thought we would eventually get married. The honesty was appreciated. Yet hearing the words aloud created a new understanding. Suddenly the comments felt different. The stories. The comparisons. The constant reminders. Maybe they were not random at all. Maybe Lauren was not simply a pleasant memory. Maybe in Margaret's mind, she represented a future that never happened. And if that was true, I found myself wondering something I had never seriously considered before. After 3 years of marriage, was Margaret still comparing me to the woman she originally wanted sitting in my place? For the next several days, I could not stop thinking about Daniel's answer. Not because I was jealous of Lauren. The truth was that I had never met her. She had ended her relationship with Daniel years before I entered his life. As far as I knew, she was happily living somewhere else, completely unaware that her name still floated through family conversations like a guest who never officially left. What bothered me was something much deeper. I had started wondering whether I was competing against a memory instead of a real person. And memories are impossible to compete with because people only remember the parts they choose to keep. A week later, Daniel and I attended another family event. This time it was a graduation party for one of his younger cousins. The celebration took place at a community center decorated with balloons, banners, and folding tables covered in food. By then, I had started paying attention to things I previously ignored. The moment Margaret arrived, I found myself watching the way she interacted with relatives. I listened more carefully. I noticed more details. At first, everything seemed normal. She greeted people warmly. She complimented the graduate. She spent time helping organize gifts near the entrance. For nearly an hour, Lauren's name never came up. I began feeling relieved. Maybe I had exaggerated the pattern in my head. Maybe the previous gatherings had simply been coincidences. Then someone complimented a photo display that showed pictures from various family events over the years. Margaret smiled and pointed toward an older photograph. That was from Daniel's college graduation, she said. Several relatives walked over to look. Then came the comment I should have expected by now. Lauren was there that day too. The conversation immediately shifted. Once again, stories followed. Once again, smiles appeared around the group. Once again, I stood nearby pretending not to notice. The difference was that now I was paying attention to something else. I was watching Daniel. For the first time, he seemed uncomfortable too. Not dramatically uncomfortable, just aware. His smile looked forced. His responses became shorter. At one point, he glanced toward me with an expression I had not seen before. Concern. Later in the afternoon, I found myself sitting alone near the edge of the room while guests mingled around the buffet tables. One of Daniel's older cousins sat beside me. We talked casually for several minutes before she suddenly said something unexpected. "You handle those conversations better than I would." I looked at her. "What conversations?" She smiled knowingly. "The Lauren conversations." For a moment I was speechless. This was the first time anyone besides Daniel had acknowledged what I was experiencing. "You noticed that?" I asked. She laughed softly. "Everyone notices it." Her answer surprised me. I had spent weeks wondering whether the problem existed only in my imagination. Apparently it did not. "Then why does nobody say anything?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Because people are used to it." Then she added something that stayed with me. "Being used to something does not make it right." The conversation ended when someone called her away, but her words remained with me for the rest of the day. On the drive home, Daniel was unusually quiet. Finally, he sighed. "I owe you an apology." I turned toward him. "For what?" He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I think I finally saw what you have been trying to explain." I remained silent. Daniel continued. "It is not just that Mom talks about Lauren. It is the way she does it." Hearing those words felt strangely validating. Not because I wanted him to criticize his mother. Because I wanted him to understand. "How did you not notice before?" I asked gently. He laughed without humor. "Because I grew up with it." Then he shook his head. "I guess when something happens long enough, you stop questioning it." We drove the rest of the way home discussing moments from previous years. As we talked, more examples surfaced. Comments at holidays. Stories during birthdays. Comparisons disguised as compliments. Small moments that seemed harmless individually but formed a very different picture when viewed together. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I realized something important. The problem was no longer whether Margaret talked about Lauren. The problem was that she continued using Lauren's memory as a measuring stick. And after 3 years of marriage, I was beginning to wonder if Margaret had ever truly allowed herself to see me as Daniel's wife instead of simply the woman who arrived after someone else left. That realization stayed with me for weeks. Once I began looking back, I could not stop seeing examples that I had previously dismissed. The human mind has a strange way of normalizing discomfort when it arrives in small pieces. One awkward comment becomes an isolated incident. One comparison becomes a misunderstanding. One uncomfortable family dinner becomes something easier to forget than confront. But when enough of those moments accumulate, they eventually form a pattern that can no longer be ignored. One evening, while Daniel was finishing some work in his home office, I found myself scrolling through old family photographs on social media. I was not searching for Lauren. In fact, I had spent years trying not to think about her at all. Yet there she was, in picture after picture from years before I entered the family. Birthday parties, holiday dinners, summer vacations. What struck me was not her presence. It was Margaret's. In nearly every photograph, Margaret stood beside her smiling proudly. The images revealed something I had never fully understood before. Lauren had not simply dated Daniel. She had become deeply integrated into the family. Looking at those photos, I finally understood why the memory remained so powerful. The relationship had lasted nearly 6 years. Long enough for expectations to form. Long enough for future plans to exist. Long enough for people to imagine a life that never happened. When Daniel walked into the living room later that night, he immediately noticed my expression. "What is wrong?" he asked. I handed him my phone. He studied several photos before sitting down beside me. "I forgot about some of these." I nodded. "I think I understand your mother a little better now." Daniel looked surprised. "You do?" I pointed toward one of the pictures. She was not just attached to Lauren. She was attached to the future she imagined. Daniel remained quiet. The longer he looked at the photos, the more thoughtful he became. Finally, he sighed. "Maybe." Then he added something important. "But that does not make what she is doing okay." Hearing him say those words mattered more than I expected. Not because I wanted validation, because I wanted partnership. For the first time, it felt like we were looking at the same situation through the same lens. Over the following month, several smaller incidents reinforced my growing understanding of the problem. During a family dinner, Margaret mentioned a recipe that Lauren used to make. During a phone conversation with Daniel, she brought up an old vacation that Lauren once joined. During another gathering, she referenced a volunteer project Lauren participated in years earlier. None of the comments were openly hostile. None of them sounded malicious. Yet the repetition itself became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while meeting Lauren for coffee, I described the latest example. My friend listened carefully before asking a question. "Have you ever noticed something?" she said. "What?" She leaned forward slightly. "Every story your mother-in-law tells about Lauren focuses on who Lauren was. Very few stories focus on who you are." The observation hit me immediately, because it was true. Margaret could describe Lauren's personality, hobbies, interests, and accomplishments in remarkable detail. Yet after 3 years of marriage, I struggled to remember a single moment when she spoke about me with that same enthusiasm. The realization was painful, but it also clarified something important. The problem was no longer Lauren. The problem was visibility. I was present in every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone. Yet somehow I still felt like a supporting character in a story where the leading role belonged to someone who left years ago. A few days later, I experienced the moment that truly changed my perspective. Daniel and I attended his niece's birthday party. During the celebration, one of the younger children asked Margaret a simple question. "Who is Emily?" The little girl had been looking through an old family photo album. Margaret smiled warmly. "She is Daniel's wife." The answer was technically correct, but something about it bothered me. After all these years, that was all she saw. Not Emily. Not a person with her own identity, history, and place within the family. Simply Daniel's wife. That evening, while driving home, I stared out the window and finally accepted a truth I had been avoiding. The real competition never existed. Lauren was not competing with me. She was living her own life somewhere else. The actual issue was that Margaret seemed unable to let go of a version of the past that no longer existed. And until she did, I was not sure she would ever truly see the person sitting right in front of her. The realization brought an unexpected sense of relief. For weeks, I had been carrying emotions that I could not fully explain. Hurt, frustration, self-doubt. Yet once I accepted that Lauren was never the real issue, those feelings started changing into something else. Clarity. One evening, Daniel and I sat on our back patio watching the sun disappear behind the neighboring houses. The air was cool, and the quiet felt comforting after a long day. I told him everything I had been thinking. Not about Lauren. Not about old photographs. Not about family gossip. About respect. I do not need your mother to love me the way she loved Lauren, I said. Daniel looked at me carefully. Then what do you need? The answer came more easily than I expected. I need her to see me. He remained silent. I need her to stop measuring me against someone else. Daniel nodded slowly. That is fair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. You know what I think the hardest part is? I shook my head. Mom probably does not even realize she is doing it. His observation lingered with me. The more I thought about it, the more I believed he was right. Margaret never looked pleased when I seemed uncomfortable. She never openly criticized me. She never tried to start arguments. In her mind, she was probably sharing memories, remembering someone she once cared about. The problem was that intentions and impact are not always the same thing. A person can cause pain without meaning to. A person can create distance while believing they are building connection. A few days later, another family dinner gave me a chance to observe things from a different perspective. This gathering took place at Daniel's aunt's house. About 20 relatives attended. The atmosphere felt familiar. Food covered every available surface. Conversations overlapped. Children moved between rooms carrying plates of dessert. At one point, I found myself standing in the kitchen with several relatives discussing travel plans. Margaret joined the conversation and immediately began telling a story about a beach trip from years earlier. I braced myself. Sure enough, Lauren's name appeared within the first minute. Yet this time something felt different. Instead of focusing on my own discomfort, I watched everyone else's reactions. To my surprise, several relatives looked slightly uncomfortable too. One cousin changed the subject quickly. Another relative avoided eye contact. For the first time, I realized something important. I was not the only person noticing the pattern. Other people saw it too. They simply chose not to address it. Later that evening, Daniel's older sister sat beside me on the patio. We talked casually about work, home projects, and family plans. Then she unexpectedly brought up a subject I had never discussed with her. I hope you know that Mom's comments are not about you. I looked at her. She smiled sympathetically. She gets stuck in the past sometimes. Hearing those words from another family member felt strangely validating. Does everybody notice? I asked. She laughed softly. More than you think. Then her expression became thoughtful. The problem is that nobody has ever challenged it. That statement stayed with me throughout the drive home. Nobody had challenged. Not because people agreed with it, because they had learned to live around it. Suddenly I understood why the behavior continued year after year. Silence creates permission. Every uncomfortable smile, every awkward laugh, every ignored comment had allowed the pattern to survive. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror preparing for bed when a thought entered my mind with complete certainty. I was finished pretending the comments did not matter. Not because I wanted conflict. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I respected myself too much to keep accepting a role I never agreed to play. I was not competing against a memory. I was not auditioning for acceptance. I was not trying to become a replacement for someone else. I was Emily, Daniel's wife, a member of the family in my own right. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I realized that acknowledging my own value did not require Margaret's permission. It only required my own. The next family gathering was scheduled for 2 weeks later. As I marked the date on my calendar, I felt something I had not felt in months. Confidence. Not confidence that everything would magically improve. Confidence that if the pattern continued, I would finally be ready to address it honestly. And deep down, I suspected that moment was coming much sooner than anyone expected. The family gathering arrived sooner than I expected. It was a Sunday afternoon in early fall, and Daniel's aunt had organized a large luncheon to celebrate her wedding anniversary. Nearly every branch of the family tree seemed to be represented. The house buzzed with conversation from the moment we arrived. Cars lined both sides of the street. Children played in the backyard. Relatives moved from room to room carrying plates of food and cups of coffee. As Daniel and I walked toward the front door, I felt unusually calm. A few weeks earlier, I would have arrived anxious about what might happen. This time was different. I was not worried about Lauren. I was not worried about comparisons. I was simply paying attention. The afternoon began pleasantly enough. Daniel spent time helping his uncle set up extra tables while I joined several relatives in the kitchen. The conversations felt natural, comfortable. For the first hour, nothing unusual happened. Then Margaret arrived. I watched as she greeted family members and settled into her usual role at the center of the room. At first, everything seemed normal. She complimented the decorations. She laughed with cousins. She shared updates about a community project she had recently joined. Part of me wondered whether perhaps the pattern had finally run its course. Then, during lunch, someone mentioned a local charity event that would take place later in the year. The moment I heard the topic, a strange feeling settled over me. It was not fear. It was recognition. I had seen this sequence before. One relative asked whether anyone planned to volunteer. Another shared memories of past events. Then Margaret smiled. "That reminds me of Lauren," she said. The words landed exactly where I expected them to. Several people glanced downward. Others exchanged brief looks. For the first time, I noticed how many family members immediately became uncomfortable whenever her name appeared. Margaret continued talking. She was always wonderful at organizing community events. A few polite smiles appeared around the table. Then she added something that made the room noticeably quieter. She just had a gift for connecting with people. The comment itself was not shocking. The problem was context. Everyone knew I had spent years volunteering with local organizations. Everyone knew community service was important to me. Margaret knew that too. Yet somehow the conversation always returned to Lauren. Across the table, Daniel slowly set down his fork. He did not look angry. He looked disappointed. That expression caught my attention immediately. A few months earlier, he would have barely noticed the comment. Now he was seeing the pattern as clearly as I was. Margaret continued speaking without realizing the atmosphere had changed. She shared another story. Then another. The longer she talked, the quieter the room became. Finally, Daniel's sister gently changed the subject. Conversation shifted elsewhere, and lunch continued. Yet something important had happened. For the first time, I realized I was no longer the only person affected by these comments. The entire family felt the awkwardness. They simply did not know how to address it. Later that afternoon, Daniel and I found a quiet moment together near the backyard. He looked frustrated. I did not realize how often it happens. I nodded. "Now you do." He stared toward the house for several seconds. "It is almost automatic for her." That description felt accurate. The comments no longer seemed intentional in a calculated sense. They felt habitual. A pattern repeated so many times that Margaret no longer recognized it. Daniel sighed heavily. "I think I need to talk to her." Hearing those words felt significant. Not because I wanted him to confront his mother. Because I wanted him to understand the reality of what had been happening. "What would you say?" I asked. He thought carefully before answering. "The truth." Then he looked directly at me. "I would tell her that every time she compares you to someone else, she misses the chance to know who you actually are." The statement stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. It was simple, honest, and more insightful than anything either of us had said before. As the gathering slowly wound down, I noticed Margaret laughing with relatives in the living room. Looking at her, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not resentment, sadness. Because I was beginning to understand that she was trapped by the same pattern that hurt everyone else. She kept reaching into the past because she had never fully accepted the present. The problem was that the present was sitting right in front of her. And unless something changed soon, she might continue missing it. As Daniel and I drove home that evening, neither of us knew that another family gathering only a few weeks away would finally force the entire issue into the open once and for all. 3 weeks later, the moment I had been expecting finally arrived. Daniel's cousin hosted a large family dinner to celebrate a recent promotion. The gathering took place at a private banquet room in a local restaurant. Nearly everyone was there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, spouses, even relatives who rarely attended family events had shown up that evening. The atmosphere was cheerful. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates of food. Conversations flowed easily. For most of the night, everything felt surprisingly peaceful. Daniel sat beside me and several family members spent time sharing stories about work, travel, and upcoming holidays. I found myself genuinely enjoying the evening. Then dessert arrived. Looking back now, I realize how quickly everything changed. One innocent conversation shifted the entire direction of the night. Someone at the table asked about relationships and how different couples first met. People began sharing stories. Laughter filled the room as relatives described awkward first dates and unexpected introductions. Daniel's aunt pointed toward us. "Emily, how did you and Daniel meet?" I smiled and prepared to answer. Before I could speak, Margaret jumped into the conversation. "Well, it was very different from when Daniel dated Lauren." The room immediately became quieter. Not completely silent, just noticeably quieter. Several people looked down at their plates. Others exchanged quick glances. I felt Daniel stiffen beside me. Margaret continued speaking as though nothing unusual had happened. "Lauren met everyone so quickly. She became part of the family almost immediately." Nobody responded. The silence seemed to encourage her rather than stop her. She smiled nostalgically. She was just one of those people. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Some connections are simply easier than others." The words hung in the air. Nobody laughed. Nobody smiled. Even Margaret seemed to notice the shift. I looked around the room and realized something important. Every person present understood exactly what she had implied. For years, I would have smiled awkwardly and waited for the discomfort to pass. For years, I convinced myself that staying silent kept the peace. But sitting there that night, surrounded by people who had watched the same pattern unfold over and over again, I suddenly understood that silence was not protecting peace. It was protecting a problem. I set my fork down carefully. My heart was beating fast, but my voice remained calm. "Margaret," I said gently. Every conversation in the room stopped. She looked toward me with surprise. "Yes." For a moment I considered backing down. Then I remembered every family gathering, every comparison, every story, every time I had felt invisible while someone else occupied space that belonged to the present. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She nodded. "Of course." I took a slow breath. "Do you know how many times I have heard Lauren's name during family gatherings over the last 3 years?" The room remained completely silent. Margaret looked confused. "I do not know." I nodded. "Neither do I. Because there have been too many to count." Her expression shifted immediately. For the first time all evening she seemed uncertain. I continued speaking calmly. "This is not about Lauren. I have never blamed her. She has done nothing wrong." Several relatives listened carefully. Nobody interrupted. What hurts is that every time we gather as a family, someone from the past becomes more visible than the people who are actually here. Margaret opened her mouth slightly, but no words came out. I continued. "I spent years wondering whether I was imagining it. Then I learned something interesting." My eyes moved briefly around the room. Everybody notices it. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded almost imperceptibly. Daniel reached for my hand beneath the table. "I have tried very hard to become part of this family," I said. "Not because I wanted to replace anyone. Because I wanted to belong as myself." Margaret's face softened. The confidence she usually carried seemed to disappear. For the first time, she looked genuinely affected by what she was hearing. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "Mom, Emily is right." The room became even quieter. "I should have said something a long time ago." Margaret stared at him. Then she looked back at me. For several seconds nobody spoke. The silence felt different now. Not awkward. Honest. And for the first time in years, the conversation everyone had avoided was finally happening in the open. For several seconds after Daniel spoke, nobody moved. The restaurant seemed quieter than it had all evening. Conversations from other tables faded into the background while everyone at ours remained focused on Margaret. I watched her carefully. The defensive response I had expected never arrived. Instead, she looked confused. Not confused about what had been said. Confused about how she had never seen it herself. Finally, she looked at me. "Emily, I never meant to hurt you." Her voice sounded softer than usual. I nodded slowly. "I believe that." And I did. If I thought Margaret had been intentionally cruel, this conversation would have happened years earlier. The problem was never malice. The problem was blindness. Margaret lowered her eyes toward the table. I was just sharing memories. Daniel spoke gently. The memories were not the issue, Mom. She looked at him. Then what was? Daniel took a breath. You never seemed to notice that every story about Lauren came at the expense of getting to know Emily. The words landed heavily. Margaret sat back in her chair. Around us, relatives remained silent. Nobody appeared eager to interrupt. For the first time, everyone seemed willing to let the truth have room to exist. Margaret looked at me again. Is that really how it felt? The question surprised me because it sounded sincere. Not defensive. Not argumentative. Genuine. I nodded. It felt like every family gathering included a reminder that someone else had once occupied my place. Her expression changed immediately. I could see the realization beginning to form. That was never my intention. I offered a small smile. I know. Then I added something I had only recently understood myself. Intentions matter. But impact matters too. Margaret stared at the table for several moments. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a sadness I had never heard before. I think I have been living in the past longer than I realized. Nobody rushed to respond. The honesty of the statement seemed to affect everyone in the room. Daniel's sister quietly nodded. One of the cousins looked relieved. Even Daniel appeared surprised by how openly his mother was speaking. Margaret folded her hands together. Lauren was part of our family for a long time. She paused. When that relationship ended, I do not think I ever fully let go of the future I expected. Hearing her say it aloud connected every piece of the puzzle. The photographs. The stories. The comparisons. The nostalgia. None of it had truly been about Lauren. It had been about an unfinished expectation that Margaret carried for years without realizing how much space it occupied. She looked directly at me. And while I was holding on to that future, I failed to appreciate the one that actually happened. My eyes immediately filled with emotion. Not because the words erased the past. Because they acknowledged it. There is something powerful about being seen after feeling invisible for so long. Margaret continued. You have been part of this family for 3 years. She shook her head slightly. And I spent too much of that time looking backward instead of looking at who was standing right in front of me. The room remained quiet. Yet the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt meaningful. Daniel squeezed my hand gently beneath the table. Then he spoke. Mom, nobody is asking you to erase memories. Margaret nodded. I know. We are just asking you to make room for the present. Her eyes softened. You are right. Several relatives visibly relaxed. It was as though everyone had been carrying the tension for years without realizing it. One aunt even laughed softly. I think this conversation was overdue. Few people smiled. The atmosphere slowly began changing. Not because the issue had disappeared. Because it had finally been acknowledged. Before the evening ended, Margaret turned toward me one final time. I owe you an apology. I remained silent and listened. Not for remembering someone from the past, but for allowing those memories to overshadow someone who deserved better from me. The words were simple, honest, and more meaningful than any dramatic speech could have been. As Daniel and I drove home later that night, neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he glanced at me. How do you feel? I looked out the window at the city lights passing by. Then I smiled. Lighter. Because for the first time since this entire situation began, I was no longer carrying the burden alone. The truth was finally out in the open. Margaret had heard it. The family had heard it. Most importantly, I had finally said it. And sometimes healing begins the moment people stop pretending that a problem does not exist. The weeks that followed felt different in ways I had not expected. Not dramatic. Not perfect. Simply different. The conversation at the restaurant did not magically erase years of habits overnight. Real change rarely happens that way. But something important had shifted. The truth no longer lived in silence. Everyone knew it. Everyone had heard it. And once something is acknowledged openly, it becomes much harder to ignore. About a month later, the family gathered again for Thanksgiving. As Daniel and I drove to his aunt's house, I noticed that I was not rehearsing conversations in my head. I was not preparing myself for uncomfortable comparisons. For the first time in a very long while, I felt relaxed. When we arrived, relatives greeted us warmly. The familiar sounds of family filled the house. Laughter came from the kitchen. Football played softly in the living room. Children raced through hallways carrying paper crafts they had made earlier that morning. Everything felt normal. In the best possible way. Margaret arrived shortly after we did. I will admit that part of me felt nervous when I saw her walk through the door. Old habits can be difficult to forget. Yet almost immediately I noticed something different. She hugged me first. Not because anyone was watching. Not because she wanted credit. Simply because she wanted to. "Emily," she said warmly, "I am glad you are here." The words were simple. Yet they carried a sincerity that had been missing before. Throughout the afternoon, I found myself observing quietly. Not looking for mistakes. Just noticing. When relatives discussed volunteer projects, Margaret asked me questions about a fundraiser I had recently helped organize. When someone complimented a dessert on the table, she immediately told everyone that I had made it. When family members discussed upcoming holiday plans, she included me naturally in the conversation. There were no comparisons, no references to the past, no invisible measuring stick hanging over every interaction. The change was subtle enough that an outsider might never notice it. But I noticed. Daniel noticed. Most of all, Margaret noticed. At one point during dinner, she stood beside me while helping clear dishes from the table. The kitchen was busy with relatives carrying plates and leftovers in every direction. In the middle of the chaos, she quietly touched my arm. "Thank you," she said. I looked at her. "For what?" Her expression softened. "For being honest with me." I smiled gently. "Thank you for listening." For a moment, neither of us said anything else. We simply continued helping with the dishes. Yet somehow that small exchange meant more than any dramatic apology ever could. It represented effort, accountability, growth. Later that evening, Daniel and I sat together in the living room while relatives talked around us. His niece climbed onto the couch and showed me a drawing she had made. Several family members joined the conversation. I laughed more that night than I had at any gathering in years. Not because everyone suddenly changed, because I finally felt like I belonged without conditions. As the evening came to an end, I found myself standing near the front door saying goodbye to relatives. Margaret hugged me again before leaving. Then she smiled. "See you at Christmas." I smiled back, looking forward to it. After she left, Daniel wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "You know," he said, "I do not think I have ever seen Mom this relaxed." I thought about that for a moment. Then I realized he was right. Letting go of the past had not only helped me, it had helped her too. She no longer needed to carry expectations that belonged to another chapter of life. She could finally appreciate the family that actually existed instead of mourning one that never happened. On the drive home, I looked out at the holiday lights decorating houses throughout the neighborhood. The road ahead stretched quietly beneath the night sky. For years, I believed the goal was to win a competition that never truly existed. I thought I needed to prove my worth, earn my place, convince someone to choose the present over the past. In the end, none of that was necessary. My value had never depended on comparison. My place in the family had never required replacing anyone. The real victory came from recognizing my own worth and speaking honestly when it mattered. Families are imperfect. People carry old expectations, old memories, old disappointments. But healing becomes possible when those things are acknowledged instead of hidden. As Daniel reached for my hand across the center console, I realized something that made me smile. There were finally no more ghosts sitting at the table. Only the people who were actually there. And for the first time, that felt like enough.